In this demo, we are going to have a look at Azure Virtual Networking. And to get started with that, we need to get started by opening up a browser and then signing in into the Azure portal. So I want to be going into portal.azure.com and sign in with a owner subscription or with an owner version of my license into this subscription. In my environment, I have already a couple of resource groups in place. But if I want to play and test with some networking, one of the steps we could take is get started by creating a new network. So first, my first step is creating a new demo resource group. And I'm going to place that resource group in West Europe. Actually, the location of where the resource group is created doesn't really matter when it comes to creating your networks. In my resource group, which is now empty, I can start building a network. So I'm going to go and search for vnet in the search bar, and this is where it shows my virtual networks. In here, I can go and create a new virtual network, and I'm going to select that resource group I just created, and I'm going to give my resource group my virtual network a name. For example, vnet001. Now the region is actually important because this decides where my resources will be that will be connecting with this network. Then I can set up my address space, and in my example I want to change the default to, for example, something like 172.16.0.0/16, and then I want to create one subnet inside that has a certain name, for example, subnet for my, let's say my ADDS environment. And then I'm going to create that subnet with a certain arrow space in here. So I'm going to use 0.0/24, which perfectly fits inside the /16 environment. Now I'm going to click add here, and then I'm going to go into security. And this is where I could go and start building a bastion host, a DDoS protection plan, and I could be building a firewall. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to go and skip all that and create that network. Now the network creation is not going to take a very long time. Network creation actually goes really quick. And once the network is created, we can see all kinds of information about the network as well as the subnets we have. Now, if I open up my selected subnet, you will notice that there's quite a couple of extra settings that I could go and take. For example, I could choose my own routing tables. I could choose the network security groups that I want to associate. I can enter the users that are able to work with this network, where we can actually set up role assignments for this specific subnet. And there are two other extra options that we might find interesting. First of all, we can set up subnet delegation. What we can do is choose where this subnet is going to be used for. So maybe if I want to make use of this subnet for only Cosmos databases or Cray servers or maybe Azure VMware solutions, then this is something that I could select. Or on the other hand, what we can also do is create service endpoints towards some platform as a service components that we have available inside Azure. So for example, if I now know that my subnet hosts should be able to connect in the back to, for example, a Microsoft Key Vault or Service Bus or SQL environment, then I want to select those endpoints as possible connections. This creates a shortcut towards those platforms in Azure. I'm going to go and leave everything in place. And here we now see that there's a subnet. If I want, I can also add extra subnets. Maybe I want to go and name this second subnet the subnet I will use for my Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts. Or Windows Virtual Desktop host pools. That I can just go and put into the next subnet range. Then in here, we could, for example, say that if, for example, my session hosts should be able to communicate with, for example, SQL or Microsoft Storage, then I'm going to go and add those two to the list. This creates that subnet in my list. Just to refresh, and we get to see the subnet here. There's also other components that are very important in this case, especially when setting this up for Windows Virtual Desktop. One of the settings is that in your subnet where there is Active Directory domain service devices, there will be a computer that is going to be the domain controller. And that domain controller needs to be found on the environment in DNS. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to be sure that I select my DNS server here. However, only do this whenever that domain controller is in place. But this is where you could go and say, hey, my default DNS server is 172.16.0.0.10 if that would be the location for my first domain controller. And maybe I'm going to go and choose for 16.0.11 if that is where my second domain controller will be. For fallback scenarios, we could go and choose any other public DNS server here. So this would be quite a normal configuration if these two IP addresses would be your domain controllers in that subnet. Then from this location, we can also set up the peering. And with peering, we can actually connect our network to another network. And with virtual network peering, it really doesn't matter where that other network is. So it's not limited to, for example, your own subscription or location, or it can even go to outside of your tenant. To demonstrate this, I'm going to create another virtual network, and I'm going to create that virtual network in another location and in another subscription. So I'm going to create in that other subscription a new resource group, which I also will call demo. Then I'm going to name this vnet 002, and I'm going to place this vnet somewhere on the other side of the globe. Let's say I want to put this in Korea. Then in the IP addresses, I'm going to choose for the default addressing, which is actually way too big for a normal Azure network, because who is going to have this amount of VMs? But still, for now, this is fine. I'm going to leave all the defaults, and then I'm going to go and create that virtual network. So after running the final validation, where I'm creating this new virtual network in a different subscription, in a different region, I'm going to click Create. Now this should also not take too long. However, it will take a little bit longer because it is going to be created on the other side of the planet in that data center where it will be hosting the network. So as you see, if you would count the seconds, it takes a little bit longer. So as the deployment is in progress, we can actually go and zoom in a little bit. Oh, there it is already. The network is here, so we should not be taking too long. And as you can see now, my deployment is complete. We can go in the network and we can see it here. And we have basically the same kind of settings. However, now this network is located in Korea. So with this, I want to go back to my first network, which is vnet 001 in a different subscription and a different location. I'm going to select this one. I'm going to go into peerings, and then I want to add my peering. One of the things I need to do is that I need to select the virtual network I want to peer to. I can then go into that other subscription, use that network I just created in Korea, and now the only thing necessary is that I need to go and name my peering. So I could say that I want to do vnet 001 to vnet 002. And it has to begin, and it cannot use any spaces. And that is actually the message that I'm getting. And also from the other side to this vnet, I'm going to go and do vnet 002 to vnet 001. If I want to be vnet peering between my vnet and a vnet that is in another tenant, I need to know the vnet resource ID. That vnet resource ID is in the properties. Some of the settings that we can also apply here is when it comes to the configuration, we, for example, can allow or disable network access from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 1. And we can allow forwarding traffic between the vnets and maybe allow gateway transit if we have a gateway in place. With this, I'm just going to connect. The VNet peerings are being created from both ends. And I can just wait to refresh for the VNets to be created. In the beginning, the status is set to updating, but as soon as the connection is finished, it should be established. In the meantime, we can actually go into the properties of the VNet itself, and this is what the resource ID is like. If you want to go and connect to a VNet using VNet peering in another tenant, this is the ID you need for that. It's in properties, and just copy it out and send it over to your other tenant and make sure you can work with that. Inside my VNet peering, as I can see, it's now finished. I can check, refresh, and you can see that it's actually connected. From now on, I will be able to connect between two machines inside the two different VNets. Now, one of the other things is that at this point, there is no connected devices. As we talked about in the drawing, we can create network interfaces. And the cool part is you can even create a network interface without even connecting a component to it. So let's say I'm going to name this NIC001. I can just put it into VNet1 and I can choose the subnet I want this to become part of. Then I will be going and click next, and create that network interface. The funny part here is that without the network interface doesn't even has anything connected to it. However, if I check my VNet again, that I just created and connected that NIC to, I can see that there's my NIC, my network interface, and it already gotten an IP address. This is the first available IP address. In Azure networking, there is also always 5 IP addresses that are taken for in reservations. Typically, if you would create, for example, a subnet mask or a subnet like this, like we just created, /24, that would mean that we would have a IP range in here that starts at 172 and then 16.0.0. That would be our lowest value possible, and the highest value possible would be 16.0.255. Now, typically in normal networking on-prem, you would take the calculation of n minus 2, the number of available addresses, minus 2, which would equal 254. That would be the amount of IP addresses we could assign. However, in Azure, we need to not use n minus 2, but we need to do n minus 5. So with n minus 5, this means that we can go and only allow for 251 addresses. This is because a couple of reservations that we will have per subnet in an Azure VNet. First of all, the 0 address is your network identifier. And the 1 address always is the default gateway, meaning the router in your VNet. Then there is, of course, the 255, which we typically use, or that we always use as a broadcast ID. But in Azure, also the 2 and the 3 are reserved. Those are reserved for monitoring purposes and configuration purposes. And also the 3 would be used for so-called service endpoint connections. So therefore we have 5 addresses that we are not allowed to use, and that means that in our example here we see that the first available IP address is the 1604 address. That is how that is being configured. So, to conclude, building virtual networks and peering them is not that difficult in Azure. It's very easy to set up your network as long as you know that your network has an address range subnets that you need to be using. Actually, you could be using the diagram view to show what we have connected into a network. And in this example, there's not much there. There's my VNet, my subnet, and the NIC. For example, if I check another example network I have and check out the networking environment, you can actually see the VNet, the subnet, all the different NICs that we have connected. And in this case, the network interface card has a virtual machine connected, as well as a network security group and a public IP address. And in my case, all of them have the same config when it comes to all that. So that concludes our demo in setting up Azure Virtual Networking.